Welcome to the debate. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the really haunting, labyrinthine world of Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, definitely. It's quite the maze.
It really is. And specifically, we're focusing on his deeply complex use of literary doubling, the doppelganger. We'll be looking at how this motif operates across his short narratives. And our entire discussion today is grounded in the frankly brilliant scholarly analysis provided by Miriam Fernandez Santiago.
It is such a rich text to dig into honestly, because Poe's doubles are everywhere. I mean, you can barely turn a page without tripping over a mirror image or a twin or, some fractured psyche.
Exactly. And that brings us to the central question we are exploring today. We really have to ask, is Poe's use of the literary double fundamentally a structural aesthetic device? Like, was he using it to achieve what he famously called a unity of effect, while essentially making a metafictional comment on the nature of art itself? Or, and this is where we disagree, is there something messier at play?
Right. The alternative being that this doubling is primarily a psychological and frankly moral exploration. Is it an expression of fractured human identity and the very real, deeply rooted societal anxieties of the 19th century?
Precisely. Now, I will be arguing that Poe's doubling is, above all, an elaborate compositional tool. It's a highly calculated aesthetic choice that aligns perfectly with his critical views on narrative harmony and, well, how text imitates reality.
And I will be taking the contrasting perspective, because while Poe's structural brilliance is totally undeniable, obviously, I will argue that his use of the doppelganger relies entirely upon visceral, psychoanalytic terror. It's a reflection of profound moral conflicts, the heavy mechanism of psychological repression, and just the desperate human struggle against societal imprisonment.
Let's get right into it then. From my perspective, Poe's use of doubling completely transcends the basic Gothic trope of a psychologically unbalanced character. We can't just look at his work and say, oh, this character is going mad. If we look at Poe's own critical framework, particularly his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, he tells us exactly what he's doing.
Right, the famous essay.
Yeah, and in it, he argues and views an obvious rule of art that effects should be made to spring from direct causes. He wasn't some diarist of the unconscious. He was a meticulous architect.
He certainly built incredible narrative structures, but I just don't think you can divorce the architecture from the anxiety of the people living inside it.
But look at how he builds that architecture. Every single instance of doubling in his work is engineered to create a specific aesthetic effect, whether that's awe, terror, or even humor. Fernandez Santiago highlights the concept of homodiegesis, which is a technique present in roughly 98% of post-prose fiction.
Which is a massive, almost obsessive repetition of a single narrative technique. You have to admit that's a bit neurotic.
It is, but it's deliberate. And for our audience, let's unpack what homodiegesis actually means in this context. Think about how Poe's narrators operate. The person telling the story is often split in two. There is the subject who is currently speaking to us, trying to sound calm and rational, and the object, the younger, historical version of themselves who actually committed the murder or experienced the terror. This split creates an incredible textual tension. It causes a certain discomfort in the reader by continuously undermining our suspension of disbelief. So the doubling isn't merely representing a mad character. It's a structural frame that manipulates the very fabric of the text to achieve compositional harmony.
I hear what you're saying about compositional harmony, and your breakdown of the narrative split is spot on. But the aesthetic impact you are describing, it is completely dependent on the psychological and sociological realities of Poe's era. A structure only feels tense if it pushes against something real.
In what way?
Well, in the 19th century, individuals were facing the massive dilution of their individuality within these rapidly expanding metropolises. The fear of losing who you are wasn't just a clever literary trick, it was a daily, pressing reality.
You're suggesting the historical context is the engine driving the effect.
Absolutely. We have to root the doppelganger in its historical and psychoanalytic origins. The source material traces this all the way back to the mythological psychomachia, which is essentially that ancient battle in the soul between the forces of Eros, the drive for life and connection, and Thanatos, the drive toward death and destruction.
Right, the classic duality.
Yeah, and this theology of moral conflict tracks back through St. Paul, Manichaeism, and St. Augustine's Confessions.
So you're saying it's a deeply ingrained cultural trauma.
Yes, and during Poe's time, the rise of early psychology and theories of dual consciousness by figures like Mesmer and Charcot, they provided a literal scientific framework for these anxieties. The doppelganger evolved into the Freudian unconscious. It's the moral struggle between our primitive appetites and the constriction of civilized society.
But does it have to be so clinical?
It's not clinical, it's visceral. Without the genuine, palpable terror of identity usurpation, without the fear of the demonic shadow or the Freudian unheimlich, that spine-chilling feeling when something familiar becomes deeply alien, the structural cleverness of Poe's tales would simply fall flat. It's the psychological resonance that gives your structural frame its power.
Okay, I appreciate how you're connecting the psychological history there, and it leads us perfectly into our first major point of contention, the nature of the narrators and how Poe subverts character. If we look closely at how Poe constructs these voices, I think we see him actively playing a game with the structure of the text itself, rather than just diagnosing a societal ill.
Well, if we look at those narrators, especially the split ones we were just talking about, they perfectly illustrate the profound internal division I am emphasizing. Take the Telltale Heart.
A classic example.
Right. The narrator explicitly asks the reader to observe how calmly, how healthily he can tell the whole story. He is desperately protesting his own sanity, but in the exact same breath, he suggests he murdered an old man he genuinely loved simply because the man's eye resembled a vulture's.
It's completely irrational.
Exactly. And this is the ultimate expression of what the critic Robert Alter categorizes as the split. It's a self-divided inwardly in a kind of moral meiosis. The host is haunted by a repressed, darker conscience. The narrative inconsistency, the wild fluctuations in tone, these aren't just structural games. They point to a mind desperately struggling against its own fractured nature.
And how does that connect to the broader societal anxieties you mentioned earlier?
Well, look at how modern queer theorists interpret these splits. Scholars have analyzed the doubling in Poe's characters as reflecting deep homosocial anxieties and a desperate resistance to normative 19th century constraints. Think about the bipart soul of Dupin in the detective stories, like the Purloined Letter.
The idea that Dupin encompasses both the creative and the resonant mind?
Right. That bipart soul has been read as a reflection of repressed erotic identification between men. The doppelganger in this reading is the incarnation of the demonic shadow that haunts the individual's social and moral status. It's the part of themselves that society tells them they must hide, rising up to consume them.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it elevates the psychological symptom over the structural design. It assumes Poe is primarily holding a mirror up to society rather than holding a mirror up to his own text.
How so? I mean, literature doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Because Poe actively subverts these traditional moral profiles specifically to toy with narrative reliability. Let's look at his male-female pairs. Literary tradition constantly relies on established dualities, the Adam and Eve, or the Macbeth and Lady Macbeth pattern. But in tales like Ligeia or The Fall of the House of Usher, Poe takes that tradition and completely flips it on its head.
You mean the moral alignment of the characters?
Exactly. His female doubles like Ligeia, who possesses the blonde, innocent body of Lady Rowena, or Madeline Usher, are incredibly noble, beautiful, and intelligent by nature. In stark contrast, their male hosts are entirely perverse. Look at the narrator in The Black Cat or Roderick Usher.
Sure, they are terribly flawed.
Flawed is an understatement. And this deliberate gender reversal strongly suggests the male characters are actually the wicked doubles of a female host. By manipulating the formula so drastically, Poe keeps the reader entirely unsure of who the true host is. Why would a psychological symptom perfectly invert a literary tradition? The psychological ambiguity is precisely calibrated to serve a structural goal. keeping the reader suspended in uncertainty. It is an exercise in formal mastery.
That's a compelling argument. But, and I have to push back here, have you considered the sheer visceral reality of the settings in which these supposedly purely formal exercises take place? I don't think you can separate the aesthetic structure from the claustrophobia of the environment. The psychological terror extends far beyond the characters, into the very rooms they inhabit.
You're talking about the Gothic architecture itself.
Yes, but these settings are not just structural containers holding the plot. They are claustrophobic projections of a repressed self, desperately fighting for individual freedom from moral imprisonment. Look at William Wilson.
One of the most explicit doppelganger stories he wrote.
Right, and where is the narrator's double introduced? Right after a suffocating description of their Elizabethan boarding school. It is explicitly described as a prison-like building. It has a claustrophobically labyrinthine interior design, and there's a sacred, heavily guarded division separating the playground from the exit.
It is quite bleak.
It's terrifying. The narrator even suggests that the existence of his double might be caused by his seclusion in this academy. The institution itself is a repressive instrument that doubles Wilson's own good host conscience.
So you're arguing the building is the psychological state made manifest?
Exactly. And we see this horizontal imprisonment, the labyrinth of the school, doubled by vertical entombment. In the cask of Amontillado, Fortunato is literally walled up underground. You can feel the dampness of the catacombs, you can hear the bricks being laid, or in A Descent into the Maelstrom, we see a vertical dichotomy between the incredible destructive potential of the oceanic underworld and the mountaintop from which the surviving brother narrates. This surface-depth dichotomy perfectly represents the subconscious attempting, often violently, to break free from moral and societal entombment.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I don't deny the presence of these intensely atmospheric, even suffocating environments. When you read William Wilson, you absolutely feel the walls closing in. But I argue that these settings are perfect textual echoes. They are a compositional technique deployed to reinforce the central thesis of the story, rather than just a psychological projection of an imagined subconscious.
Textual echoes in what sense? You're saying the brick walls aren't meant to feel like brick walls?
Think of them as physical manifestations of the narrative structure. Consider The Fall of the House of Usher, which you briefly alluded to. The term house famously stands for both the physical building and the family lineage itself. The building is granted human-like features. Poe specifically describes it as having eye-like windows,
Which stares back at the narrator as he approaches.
Yes, the house is watching him, and more importantly, at the climax of the story, when the house breaks in two and sinks, it is swallowed by the dark tarn, the lake, that has been reflecting its inverted image the entire time. The setting is literally mirroring the narrative action. It is a structural double of the Usher siblings' biological and mental decay.
Well, let me just add one more thing. Even the bizarre interior of the bridal chamber in Ligeia, located in a high turret of a castellated abbey, with its hideous and uneasy animation, contributes precisely to the narrative tension required to execute the final effect of the tale. The dichotomy between light and dark, upper and lower, is totally characteristic of tales of Gothic duality. It is less about a psychological escape from society and more about constructing a perfectly sealed, internally consistent artistic universe. But a perfectly sealed artistic universe that fails to tap into primal dread is just an empty diorama. I mean, the reason the physical entombment in the Cask of Amontillado or the labyrinth in William Wilson actually resonates with the reader is because they actualize our own internal feelings of imprisonment. If we ignore the psychological reality of the character's entrapment, I think we reduce the profound, sweaty palm terror of these stories to mere architectural cleverness.
I must push back on the idea that structural brilliance equates to empty architectural cleverness. The structure is the vehicle for the profound aesthetic experience. We aren't just observing a diorama, we are being manipulated by a master craftsman. And this brings us to perhaps the most sophisticated layer of Poe's doubling, which is the realm of art, mimesis, and metafiction.
Metafiction, meaning texts about texts?
Exactly.
Poe advances the argument of doubling from characters and settings directly into textual doubling itself. The prime example here is the oval portrait. In this scale, art, the portrait itself, becomes a double that literally feeds on nature. As the analysis in our source text notes, the transformation of life into art is inevitably a form of murder.
It's a chilling story. The artist is so obsessed with painting his wife that he doesn't realize she is dying as he paints her.
Right. He turns his eyes from the canvas, rarely even to regard his wife. And as the exactitude of life is conveyed into the art, the wife dies, replaced entirely by her perfect aesthetic double. This transfers the concept of the doppelganger from human character to the concept of mimesis itself. Art competes with and ultimately replaces life. We can connect this directly to Jacques Derrida's analysis of the Purloined Letter.
Okay. Now we are getting into some heavy literary theory.
We are, but it's crucial here. Derrida points out that Poe essentially creates doppelgangers of his narratives. His tales frame and double other texts. We see this in The Mystery of Marie Roget, which is a pastiche of real-world periodical publications that double each other, and a supposedly original plot. This points to a proto-post-structuralism in Poe's work. The ultimate aesthetic effect he achieves is undecidability. The text mimicking the host, the narrative blurring the line between the original event and the imitation of the event, it is a brilliant critical reflection on the nature of representation itself.
I come at it from a different way. I acknowledge those metafictional layers. They are definitely there and they are brilliant, but I argue that the horror of the oval portrait, or that deep narrative uncertainty in William Wilson, is fundamentally and inextricably rooted in the psychological dread of usurpation.
Usurpation meaning the fear of being replaced?
Exactly. The philosophical ambiguity you're championing, it only matters. It only holds weight for the reader sitting alone in their room at night because it evokes the ultimate nightmare. The fear that reality itself is a fiction and that our own identities can be usurped and replaced by a shadow. Let us look at the story of Hans Pfaall.
The man who travels to the moon.
Right, he escapes Rotterdam on a balloon manufactured entirely of dirty newspapers. Now, as you might say, this is a brilliant, almost humorous allegory for the volatile nature of journalistic textuality shifting into narrative fiction. But it is also a phantom doubling. It follows the conventions of the urge to escape and the mental fabrication of the host. When the narrator in William Wilson presents a cosmos that blurs the boundary dividing the real world from the dreamscape, it forces the reader to confront the terrifying possibility that the universe itself is a dream.
A complete breakdown of reality.
Completely. If we view this through a late 20th century perspective, as Fernandez Santiago suggests, it is the procession of simulacra. And for our listeners, that's this terrifying idea that the imitation, the copy, actually claims an identity and status prior to the natural item it imitates. It becomes more real than the original. In Poe's time, believing such a thing was tantamount to sheer madness. The text mimicking the host is a manifestation of the ultimate human anxiety, the fear of losing oneself entirely to the void, of being erased by your own reflection. The aesthetic effect of undecidability that you mentioned is entirely reliant on the psychological terror of losing one's grip on sanity.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are positioning the psychological terror as the master and the text as the mere servant. I argue the inverse. If we look at Poe's own critical views, resolving the ambiguity in these tales of duality would, to quote the text, suck the lifeblood out of the aesthetic effect.
But the aesthetic effect is terror.
Yes, but it's a calculated terror. The confusion, the uncertainty, the metacritical undecidability achieved by layering text on top of text, these are all tools. Poe utilized the ineffable and the uncanny specifically because they are unparalleled tools for achieving the elevation of the soul, the intellect, and the heart. Think about the awe inspired by the lifelikeness of the painting in the oval portrait. It requires the simultaneous suspension of belief and disbelief from the reader. It is an aesthetic transaction between the author and the audience, and it is facilitated entirely by the structural mechanism of the double.
I agree it's a transaction, but a craftsman must work with raw materials, and Poe's raw materials were the deepest, most terrifying anxieties of the human condition. You want to talk about structural reflections? Look at a story like The Angel of the Odd. The narrator's alcoholic intoxication is literally embodied in a genius presiding over the accidents of mankind. It's a monster with a wine pipe for a body and kegs for legs, speaking in the phonetic distortions of a drunkard.
It's a highly satirical, grotesque image.
It is grotesque, but it isn't just a clever structural reflection of the narrator's drinking habit. It is the unassimilable reality of the narrator's own degraded state staring back at him, taunting him. Robert Alter's concept of the double proper draws on ancient folktales of demonic figures that possess a maddening ability to mime the self. And why do they mime the self? Generally as part of a scheme to destroy it. Whether it is the imp of the perverse urging a character to leap from a height, or the narrator's obsession with the teeth of Berenice, the mechanism of the double in Poe is always an agent of destruction. It is a manifestation of the death drive, threatening the fragile human ego. The text is the battleground, yes, I will give you that. But the war being fought is entirely psychological and deeply moral.
I think we have mapped out the boundaries of this incredible tension perfectly. As we draw our discussion to a close, let me summarize my position. I maintain that Edgar Allan Poe was, above all, an architect of effect. His deployment of literary doubling was far more than a reliance on Gothic psychological tropes or societal anxieties. From the homodiegetic narrators who split the self into speaking subject and spoken object, to the physical settings that serve as compositional mirrors, all the way to the metafictional doubling of texts themselves, Poe engineered an elaborate exercise in mimesis. His use of the doppelganger was a brilliant, calculated tool of compositional harmony. By refusing to resolve the ambiguity of the double, he successfully elicited a profound reaction from both the intellect and the heart, achieving his ultimate goal, a singular, elevated aesthetic experience.
And to summarize my contrasting view, while it is undeniable that Poe was a master craftsman, his deployment of the doppelganger endures precisely because it taps into something far deeper than structural cleverness. The double in Poe's work resonates because it gives shape to primal, theological, and psychological fears. It is the literal manifestation of a divided self wrestling with fate, madness, the dilution of identity in the modern world, and the severe repressions of 19th-century society. The claustrophobic settings, the terror of the usurping shadow, the moral meiosis of the split self, these are not just aesthetic tools. They are raw, visceral expressions of the human mind struggling against its own darkest inclinations and the terrifying possibility that reality itself is an illusion.
It seems clear that the enduring power of Poe's work lies exactly at this intersection. It is a place where an uncanny, nearly unprecedented mastery of narrative form meets the darkest, most unfathomable depths of the human psyche.
I agree entirely. The tension between the meticulous aesthetic structure and the chaotic psychological terror is exactly what makes these narratives immortal. As we noted earlier, to resolve this ambiguity entirely, to declare it definitively just a structural game or just a psychological diary, would indeed suck the lifeblood out of the aesthetic effect.
Precisely. The text acts as a mirror chamber where every viewpoint is immediately doubled and reversed, inviting endless exploration. We respectfully invite you, our listeners, to return to these magnificent texts. Whether it be the claustrophobic halls of William Wilson, the terrifying exactitude of the oval portrait, or the dizzying descent of the maelstrom, explore these infinite reflections for yourselves and experience the profound duality of Edgar Allan Poe. Thank you for joining us.